September 11th, 1944. 12,000 feet above the Dutch coast. Flight Lieutenant Pierre Klosterman pressed his oxygen mask tight against his face as he scanned the crystal-clear autumn sky through the bubble canopy of his Hawker Tempest. Mark V. The French ace, flying with the Royal Air Force's 3 Squadron, had learned to trust his instincts in combat, and right now those instincts were screaming danger. Below him, a formation of 24 Messerschmitt 109s prowled at 8,000 feet, hunting for the Allied fighter bombers that had been terrorizing German supply columns. The German pilots, veterans of years of combat on both eastern and western fronts, flew with the confidence of men who believed they still owned the sky. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that circling 4,000 feet above them were 16 Hawker Tempests, the fastest piston-engine fighters in operational service, waiting like hawks above a field of mice. Klosterman keyed his radio transmitter. Dog's body leader to all aircraft. Huns below. Prepare to bounce on my mark. The Tempest pilots tightened their formations, each man checking his gun sight, his fuel state, his position. These were not novices. 3 Squadron and 486 Squadron, flying alongside them, were elite units equipped with the most advanced fighter the Allies had yet produced. In the next 5 minutes, the Luftwaffe would discover that German technical superiority was a myth that died somewhere over the English Channel. The engagement that followed would last exactly 7 minutes. When it ended, 11 German fighters would be smoking craters in the Dutch farmland, and not a single Tempest would have a bullet hole in it. This wasn't luck. It wasn't superior numbers. It was the result of British engineering finally getting everything right, creating a fighter that combined the firepower of a bomber, the speed of a racing aircraft, and the handling of a sports car. The Hawker Tempest didn't just meet the Luftwaffe, it dominated them so completely that German pilots began refusing to engage when Tempests were identified in the area. This is the story of how a British fighter, developed in secret, born from failure, and initially dismissed by the Air Ministry, became the aircraft that Luftwaffe pilots feared more than any other. It's about how 2,520 horsepower and 4 20mm cannons rewrote the rules of air combat in the final year of the war. And it's about how German laughter turned to horror when they realized that the technical advantage they had enjoyed for years had suddenly, violently and permanently shifted. The Hawker Tempest emerged from one of the Royal Air Force's most embarrassing failures, the Hawker Typhoon. In 1941, the Typhoon was supposed to be Britain's answer to the Focke-Wulf 190, a fast, heavily armed interceptor that could catch German hit-and-run raiders. Instead, it became a mechanical nightmare. The Typhoon's Napier Sabre engine, a massive 24-cylinder H-configuration monster, suffered from catastrophic failures. Cylinder heads cracked. Connecting rods punched through cylinder blocks. Entire engines seized without warning, turning aircraft into gliders at the worst possible moments. The tail assembly had an even more terrifying problem. It would simply fall off. Without warning, without stress, the rear fuselage would separate in flight, sending the aircraft into an uncontrollable spin. Between September 1941 and March 1943, more Typhoons were lost to structural failure than to enemy action. Pilots called it the Tiffy, and not affectionately. They also called it the Widowmaker. The Air Ministry seriously considered cancelling the entire programme. Sidney Cam, Hawker's brilliant but temperamental chief designer, refused to accept defeat. If the Typhoon was flawed, he would create something better using the lessons learned from those failures. In March 1941, even before the Typhoon entered service, Cam was already sketching a refined version. The initial concept was simple enough: take the Typhoon's basic layout, fix the structural problems, clean up the aerodynamics, and create a fighter that could fulfill the high-altitude interceptor role the Typhoon had failed to achieve. What emerged was not a simple refinement. It was a completely new aircraft that shared little with its predecessor, except the general configuration. The Tempest featured an entirely new wing, thinner, elliptical, with the radiators moved from the chin position to the wing leading edges. The fuselage was lengthened by 21 inches to improve stability and increase internal fuel capacity. The tail assembly was completely redesigned with strengthened attachment points and fail-safe redundancy throughout. Most critically, Cam planned for multiple engine options from the start. The troublesome Sabre would be offered, but only in improved form. Alternative power plants included the Bristol Centaurus Radial and the Rolls-Royce Griffon V12. This flexibility would prove crucial when engine production problems threatened to strangle the entire program. The first prototype, designated Typhoon Mark II before being renamed Tempest, flew on September 2, 1942. Test pilot Philip Lucas climbed into the cockpit at Langley, Hawker's facility, not knowing if he was flying a revolutionary fighter or another death trap. He advanced the throttle of the Sabre 4 engine to full power. 280 horsepower screamed through the four-bladed propeller. The Tempest leaped forward, accelerating with a violence that slammed Lucas back into his seat. At 3,200 feet of runway, he rotated. The Tempest climbed away at over 4,000 feet per minute, twice the rate of a Spitfire Mark V. At 15,000 feet, Lucas leveled off and pushed the throttle to maximum continuous power. The airspeed indicator climbed past 400 miles per hour, then 420, then 435. Lucas, an experienced test pilot who had flown every British fighter type, later wrote in his report, "The speed is extraordinary. At 20,000 feet, the aircraft reached 432 miles per hour in level flight, faster than any operational fighter in the world at that altitude. The handling is crisp and responsive. Control forces are heavy but progressive. The aircraft feels solid, planted, utterly lacking the skittish nervousness of the Typhoon. Most significantly, there are no vibrations, no structural complaints, no indication of the tail problems that plagued the earlier design. The visibility from the bubble canopy is superb, possibly the best of any British fighter. In a diving attack from 20,000 feet, the aircraft reached 500 miles per hour without buffeting or control issues. The wing remains effective well beyond normal operating speeds. This aircraft will revolutionize our tactical doctrine. It's not just fast, it's fast everywhere. Low altitude, medium altitude, high altitude, the performance is consistently exceptional." But the Air Ministry was skeptical. They had heard promises about the Typhoon that turned into coffins. They demanded extensive testing before committing to production. Throughout late 1942 and early 1943, multiple prototypes underwent punishing evaluation at the Aircraft and Armament Experimental Establishment at Boscombe Down. The test pilots pushed the Tempest to its limits and beyond. They flew it to its maximum speed at every altitude. They pulled maximum G-loads in combat turns. They tested it in dives that should have torn the wings off. They deliberately flew into severe turbulence. They cut engines during critical phases of flight. They tested every possible failure mode. The Tempest passed every test. More importantly, it exceeded expectations in ways that shocked even its designers. At 18,000 feet, the Tempest Mark V with the Sabre 2A engine achieved 427 miles per hour. At 10,000 feet, it could reach 400 miles per hour. Even at sea level, it managed 380 miles per hour. No operational fighter in the world, German, American, British or Soviet, could match this performance across the entire altitude range. The climb rate was equally impressive. From standing start to 15,000 feet took just 5.5 minutes. German fighters typically required 7 to 8 minutes to reach the same altitude. In combat, those extra 90 seconds meant the difference between bouncing the enemy and being bounced. The dive performance was staggering. In a 45-degree dive from 20,000 feet, the Tempest could exceed 520 miles per hour, limited only by the propeller tips reaching supersonic speeds and creating severe vibration. This was faster than most German fighters could achieve in a vertical dive. The maneuverability surprised everyone. With its long fuselage and elliptical wing, the Tempest could turn inside a Focke-Wulf 190 at speeds above 300 miles per hour. Below that speed, it could match a Messerschmitt 109 through most of the turn radius. At the sustained turn speeds where combat actually occurred, between 280 and 350 miles per hour, the Tempest was competitive with anything the Luftwaffe flew. But the real revelation came during armament testing. The Tempest Mark V carried 4 Hispano 20mm cannons, the same weapons used on late-model Spitfires. But the Tempest installation was superior in every way. The guns were mounted low in the wings, close to the fuselage, reducing dispersion. Each gun had 200 rounds of ammunition, 800 rounds total, enough for 16 seconds of continuous fire. The ammunition load was double that of German fighters using similar caliber weapons. The Hispano Mark II cannon fired a 130-gram shell at 880 meters per second. Each shell carried high explosive, armor-piercing, or incendiary filling depending on the tactical load. The standard combat mix included semi-armor-piercing high-explosive incendiary, which could penetrate light armor before detonating, and high-explosive incendiary, which detonated on contact. At convergence range, typically set at 400 yards, all four cannons intersected in a zone roughly 10 feet in diameter. Anything in that zone faced 13 shells per second, each carrying explosive force equivalent to a hand grenade. The effect on target aircraft was catastrophic. Test firings against captured German aircraft showed that a 1-second burst, slightly more than 3 shells per gun, was sufficient to destroy a fighter. A 2-second burst could cut a fighter in half. Against bombers, a 4-second burst could cause structural failure of major components. German test pilots, evaluating the weapons after the war, were stunned by the destructive power. Oberst Hans-Ulrich Rudel, Germany's most decorated pilot, flew a captured Tempest in 1946 and fired the guns at a test range. His comment was simple: if we had known what these guns could do, we would have been even more terrified. One hit from these shells and your aircraft is finished. Our 20mm Mauser were like toys compared to these British cannons. The weight of fire is incredible. In 2 seconds, you deliver more explosive than our fighters carried for their entire ammunition load. Production approval came in March 1943, but British industrial capacity was already stretched to its limits. Spitfire production consumed enormous resources. Lancaster bomber production was the highest priority. Typhoon production, despite its problems, had to continue because ground attack aircraft were desperately needed. The Tempest would have to wait its turn. The first production, Tempest Mark V, didn't roll off the assembly line at Hawker's Langley facility until June 1943. The initial production rate was painfully slow, just 15 aircraft per month. Sidney Cam personally supervised production, insisting on quality control that exceeded normal wartime standards. Every engine mounting point was X-rayed. Every wing spar was magnetically tested for cracks. Every control cable was load tested to 150% of rated strength. Cam had watched the Typhoon kill pilots through mechanical failure. He was determined that the Tempest would earn its reputation through enemy action, not structural deficiency. By January 1944, when 3 Squadron at Newchurch became the first unit to receive operational Tempests, only 93 aircraft had been produced. The squadron's commanding officer, Wing Commander Roland Beaumont, was initially sceptical. Beaumont, known as B to his pilots, was a veteran of the Battle of Britain and had more combat experience than most fighter leaders in the RAF. He had flown Hurricanes, Spitfires, and Typhoons. He had seen promising aircraft fail in combat. He had also lost friends to mechanical failures in the Typhoon. His first flight in the Tempest on January 4, 1944, changed his opinion permanently. Beaumont's flight report, preserved in the National Archives, captures his excitement. This aircraft is extraordinary. The speed is beyond anything I've experienced. The acceleration in level flight is brutal. From 250 miles per hour to 400 miles per hour in level flight takes approximately 30 seconds at 10,000 feet. The visibility from the bubble canopy provides situational awareness superior to any fighter I've flown. The gun platform is rock steady. I fired at a towed drogue at 400 yards and observed strikes with the first burst. The guns produce minimal vibration. The aircraft barely slows despite firing 4 cannons. Most critically, the aircraft feels completely trustworthy. There are no concerning vibrations, no control anomalies, no sense that the aircraft is waiting to kill you as the Typhoon always felt. If this aircraft can maintain reliability in squadron service, it will revolutionize our combat capabilities. 3. Squadron began intensive training. The pilots, experienced in Typhoons, had to unlearn habits developed in the earlier aircraft. The Tempest was faster, climbed better, and could dogfight. The Typhoon was primarily a ground attack platform that avoided combat with German fighters when possible. Squadron leader David Fairbanks, a flight commander in 3 Squadron, explained the difference in a letter to his wife dated February 12, 1944. The Tempest feels like a proper fighter. In the Typhoon, we delivered our bombs or rockets and ran for home, avoiding German fighters whenever possible. In the Tempest, we actively seek combat. The aircraft wants to fight. It accelerates into turns. It climbs when you need altitude. It dives faster than anything the Germans have. The guns are devastating. We fired at a wooden target structure yesterday. 4 seconds of fire, and the entire structure simply ceased to exist. The explosive shells literally disintegrated it. I watched gun camera footage of my firing run. The destruction is incomprehensible. Each shell creates a blast effect visible in the camera. When all 4 guns hit, the target appears to explode from within. The German fighters we've been avoiding for 2 years are about to discover what fear really means. The first operational mission occurred on February 26, 1944. 6 Tempests from 3 Squadron flew a fighter sweep over northern France, seeking targets of opportunity. They encountered no German aircraft but strafed a convoy of trucks near Abbeville. The pilots reported that the 20mm cannons were devastatingly effective against ground targets. Trucks didn't just burn, they exploded. The first air-to-air engagement came on March 9, 1944. Flight Lieutenant Fairbanks was leading a section of 4 Tempests on a patrol near Poix when they encountered 6 Focke-Wulf-190s at 8,000 feet. The German fighters from Jagdgeschwader 26, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced units, were climbing to intercept Allied bombers. Fairbanks's combat report describes what happened next. Observed 6 enemy aircraft, Focke-Wulf-190s, at 8,000 feet climbing northwest. We were at 12,000 feet with excellent position. Ordered section into echelon starboard and dove on the rear pair. Reached approximately 450 miles per hour in the dive. The lead German aircraft never saw us. I opened fire at 300 yards, 30-degree deflection. Observed strikes immediately. The enemy aircraft's port wing separated at the root. The fuselage rolled inverted and entered a spin. No parachute observed. Pulled up and observed Blue 2. Flying Officer Henderson, fire on the second enemy aircraft. The German fighter exploded. Debris struck Blue 2's aircraft, causing minor damage to the leading edge. Blue 3 and Blue 4 engaged the remaining 4 enemy aircraft, which scattered. Blue 3 claimed 1 destroyed, observed burning on the ground. Blue 4 claimed 1 damaged. The engagement lasted approximately 45 seconds. We returned to base without further incident. All aircraft operational. The speed advantage is decisive. The Germans had no opportunity to evade or counterattack. Our dive speed was so far beyond their capabilities that we were through their formation before they could react. The cannon are exactly as advertised. Short bursts produce catastrophic destruction. The Luftwaffe's response was immediate and telling. Combat reports from Jagdgeschwader 26 describe the engagement as an ambush by a new type of fighter, significantly faster than known Allied types. Oberleutnant Klaus Mitusch, a veteran with over 70 victories, filed a report that reached Luftwaffe High Command. We were engaged by a new British fighter, appearance similar to Typhoon but with different wing planform. Speed was exceptional, estimated 700 km per hour in the dive, far beyond our evasive capabilities. Firepower was heavy caliber, possibly 20mm or larger. 2 of our aircraft were destroyed instantly. No effective defence was possible. Request information on this new type and tactical recommendations. Throughout March and April 1944, as more Tempest squadrons became operational, German intelligence compiled reports on the mysterious new fighter. By early May, they had identified it as the Hawker Tempest and correctly assessed its performance characteristics. What they couldn't figure out was how to fight it. The Luftwaffe had spent years developing tactics to counter Allied fighters. Against Spitfires, they used superior dive speed and roll rate. Against Thunderbolts, they fought at medium altitudes where the heavy American fighters were less effective. Against Mustangs, they used their superior rate of climb to avoid engagement or achieve advantageous positions. None of these tactics worked against the Tempest. It was faster in the dive than a Focke-Wulf 190. It climbed faster than a Messerschmitt 109. It could turn with either at combat speeds, and its cannons were lethal at ranges where German pilots barely had a firing solution. Major Gerhard Barkhorn, the second highest scoring ace in history with 301 victories, encountered Tempests over France in May 1944. His experience was preserved in a post-war interview. I saw them below us, 4 aircraft that looked like Typhoons. We had altitude advantage, 6 aircraft against 4. I led the attack, diving from 6,000 meters. When we reached firing range, they simply accelerated away, effortlessly. We were in full power dives and they flew away in level flight. One turned back toward us. I thought perhaps he was inexperienced, offering us a target. He wasn't turning to run, he was turning to fight. He climbed into us, nearly vertical, maintaining speed that should have been impossible. I fired at extreme range, no hits. He rolled inverted at the top of his climb, dove on Schroeder, fired a burst of perhaps 2 seconds. Schroeder's aircraft came apart, not shot down, came apart. The wings folded up, the fuselage broke in half. We dove away at full power. The Tempest followed us down to 1,000 meters before breaking off. We couldn't escape them. We couldn't outclimb them. We certainly couldn't fight them. I had 200 victories at that point. I was not a novice. But against these new British fighters, I felt like a student pilot facing an instructor. The aircraft is superior to anything we have in every parameter that matters in combat. The introduction of Tempest coincided with the Allied preparations for D-Day. The aircraft's exceptional low-altitude performance made it ideal for the specialized mission that would define its reputation, hunting V-1 flying bombs. The Vergeltungswaffe 1, Vengeance Weapon 1, was Hitler's retaliation for the Allied bombing campaign. Essentially a cruise missile powered by a pulse jet engine, the V-1 flew at approximately 400 miles per hour at altitudes between 2,000 and 3,000 feet. It carried a 1,170-pound warhead that created enormous destruction when it hit London and other targets in southeast England. Intercepting V-1s was extraordinarily difficult. The flying bombs were small, fast, and flew at altitudes where most fighters performed poorly. Spitfires could catch them but barely, and only if they started with an altitude advantage. Many British fighters simply weren't fast enough at low altitude. On June 13, 1944, the first V-1s began hitting London. The devastation was immediate and terrifying. Unlike conventional bombing raids that people could take shelter from, V-1s arrived unpredictably at any hour. The psychological impact was severe. Something had to be done. The Tempest squadrons were immediately assigned to anti-V-1 patrols. The aircraft's exceptional low-altitude speed made it uniquely qualified for the mission. At 2,000 feet, a Tempest could reach 380 miles per hour, fast enough to chase down V-1s with the room to spare. The first V-1 kill by a Tempest occurred on June 16, 1944. Flight Lieutenant Joseph Berry of 3 Squadron was patrolling the Pas-de-Calais when he spotted a V-1 heading toward London. Berry's combat report is matter-of-fact. Observed flying bomb at 2,000 feet, heading 310 degrees, speed estimated 380 miles per hour. Pursued from astern, close to 200 yards, opened fire. Observed strikes on the fuselage and wing. The weapon exploded in the air. Debris passed overhead. Returned to patrol line. Total engagement time, approximately 2 minutes. Over the next 3 months, Tempest pilots became specialists in V-1 interception. They developed tactics specifically for the flying bombs. The standard approach was a stern chase, closing rapidly from behind, firing a short burst into the fuselage or wing, then braking hard to avoid the explosion. Some pilots became experts. Squadron leader Joseph Berry ultimately destroyed 59.5 V-1s, the highest score of any Allied pilot. Wing Commander Roland Beamon destroyed 31. Flight Lieutenant Raymond Baird destroyed 57. The psychological effect on British morale was significant. Civilians could watch Tempests chasing V-1s across the sky, see them explode before reaching London, and know that someone was protecting them. The RAF publicised the Tempest's success heavily. But the anti-V-1 campaign was only part of the Tempest mission. Throughout the summer of 1944, Tempest squadrons also flew armed reconnaissance missions over occupied France, seeking targets of opportunity and engaging German fighters when encountered. The results were devastating for the Luftwaffe. On June 28, 1944, Wing Commander Beamont led 12 Tempests from 3 and 486 squadrons on a sweep over northern France. Near Beauvais, they encountered approximately 30 Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s attempting to intercept Allied bombers. Beamont's after-action report describes a one-sided massacre. We had altitude advantage, 15,000 feet versus their 10,000 feet. Observed large gaggle of enemy aircraft heading northeast, positioned for bounce, led the squadron into a diving attack from astern and above, reached approximately 480 miles per hour in the dive. The Germans never saw us until we opened fire. I I selected a Messerschmitt 109 and opened fire at 350 yards. Observed strikes on the fuselage and wings. The enemy aircraft caught fire and entered a spin. I pulled up and observed multiple enemy aircraft falling in flames. The German formation scattered in all directions. We pursued individual aircraft for approximately 5 minutes. Final claims: 12 enemy aircraft destroyed, 4 probably destroyed, 3 damaged. We suffered no losses, no damage. The speed advantage provided by the Tempest allowed us to engage and disengage at will. The German pilots had no effective response. When we attacked, they died. When they tried to counterattack, we simply accelerated away. The combat reports from German units that day tell the story from the other side. The commander of TUI Gruppe, Jagdgeschwader 27, reported losing 7 aircraft with no Allied losses inflicted. His report noted, the enemy fighters demonstrated superior speed at all altitudes, superior climb, and devastating firepower. Our pilots had no tactical options. Attempts to climb away failed. The enemy climbed with us. Attempts to dive away failed. The enemy was faster in the dive. Attempts to turn failed. The enemy turned inside us at high speed. Recommend avoiding engagement with this aircraft type until tactical solutions are developed. Throughout July and August 1944, the pattern repeated. Tempest squadrons encountered German formations, bounced them from altitude, destroyed aircraft with impunity, and returned home with minimal losses. The kill ratio was staggering. 3 Squadron alone claimed 100 German aircraft destroyed in the 2 months following D-Day, against losses of 3 Tempest to German fighters. But the Tempest's most significant impact came in the autumn of 1944, when it encountered the Luftwaffe's secret weapons, the jet fighters that were supposed to restore German air superiority. The Messerschmitt Me 262, with its twin Junkers Jumo 04 turbojets, could reach 540 miles per hour, more than 100 miles per hour faster than any piston engine fighter. The Heinkel, He 162 Volksjäger, though less capable, could still exceed 520 miles per hour. These jets represented Germany's last hope for air superiority. They were fast enough that conventional fighters couldn't catch them in level flight, but they had weaknesses. The early jet engines were unreliable and required careful throttle handling. They were slow to accelerate, meaning the aircraft was vulnerable during takeoff and landing, and they weren't particularly maneuverable at high speeds. The Tempest pilots discovered they could catch jets during the critical phases of flight. More importantly, they discovered that the Tempest's exceptional speed gave them enough performance to engage jets under certain circumstances. On October 5, 1944, Squadron leader David Fairbanks of 3 Squadron achieved the first confirmed destruction of an Me-262 by a Tempest. His combat report describes the engagement, patrolling at 8,000 feet northeast of Nijmegen. Observed contrails at approximately 20,000 feet. 2 aircraft, very high speed. Climbed to intercept. Identified 2 Me-262 jet fighters heading southwest at high speed, estimated 450 miles per hour. They dove past us, heading for Allied bombers. I rolled inverted and dove after them, reaching approximately 500 miles per hour. The lead jet began pulling up to attack the bombers. As he climbed, his speed decreased. I closed to 400 yards and opened fire. Observed strikes on the port engine and wing. The engine caught fire. The jet rolled left and entered a dive. I followed him down to 2,000 feet. The pilot bailed out. The aircraft crashed near Eindhoven. My Tempest reached 520 miles per hour in the dive. At that speed, the jet had no advantage. The controls were heavy but responsive. The guns worked perfectly. This was only the beginning. As the Luftwaffe deployed more jets, Tempest squadrons developed specific tactics for engaging them. They couldn't catch jets in level flight, but they could catch them during takeoff, landing, or when the jets slowed to attack bombers. Wing Commander Beaumont shot down his first Me-262 on December 23, 1944, catching it during its landing approach to an airfield near Rhine. The jet, with its landing gear down and flaps extended, was flying at less than 200 miles per hour. Beaumont dove from 5,000 feet, reached 450 miles per hour, close to 300 yards, and fired a 2-second burst. The jet exploded in mid-air. Between October 1944 and April 1945, Tempest pilots claimed 20 Keen Me-262s destroyed, a remarkable achievement considering the jet's speed advantage. The tactics developed by the Tempest squadrons were adopted by other Allied units facing the jet threat. But destroying jets was only part of the mission. Throughout the final winter of the war, Tempest flew armed reconnaissance missions deep into Germany, attacking trains, vehicles, airfields, and anything that moved. The 4 20mm cannons proved equally effective against ground targets. On February 14, 1945, Flight Lieutenant Pierre Clostermann, the French ace flying with 3 Squadron, encountered a German armoured column near Dortmund. Clostermann's description of the attack, from his memoir The Big Show, captures the Tempest's ground attack capabilities. "We came in at 50 feet, 4 aircraft in line astern. I opened fire at 400 yards. The cannon shells walked through the column like explosions in a minefield. Each hit created a blast of fire and smoke. Trucks exploded. A half-track simply disintegrated, torn apart by the explosive shells. I saw one shell hit the road surface and explode, creating a crater you could hide a jeep in. We made 3 passes. The column ceased to exist. 30 vehicles were burning or destroyed. The road was cratered and impassable. We expended approximately 600 rounds total, 150 rounds per aircraft. The efficiency is remarkable. Each shell destroys or damages its target. There is no wasted ammunition. The Luftwaffe tried desperately to counter the Tempest threat. They analysed captured aircraft. They interviewed pilots who had survived encounters. They tested captured Tempests against their own fighters. The results were depressing. In March 1945, the Luftwaffe Test Center at Rechlin conducted comparative trials using a captured Tempest Mark V against a Focke-Wulf 190D-9, Germany's latest and best piston engine fighter. The report captured by Allied intelligence after the war was brutally honest. The Hawker Tempest is superior to the Focke-Wulf 190D-9 in all performance parameters except roll rate at high speeds. Maximum speed, the Tempest is faster at all altitudes, advantage Tempest. Climb rate, the Tempest climbs significantly faster, advantage Tempest. Dive speed, the Tempest can outdive our aircraft, advantage Tempest. Sustained turn, approximately equal at speeds above 400 km per hour, slight advantage a 190D-9 below that speed. Weapons, the Tempest's 4 20mm Hispano cannons deliver significantly more firepower than our 2 20mm Mauser and 2 13mm machine guns, advantage Tempest. Armour and durability, the Tempest's structural strength is exceptional, advantage Tempest. Pilot visibility, the Tempest's bubble canopy provides superior situational awareness, advantage Tempest. Conclusion, the Tempest represents a generational leap in fighter design. Our pilots have no tactical advantages to exploit. Engagement should be avoided when possible. The report recommended against engaging Tempests unless absolutely necessary, or when holding overwhelming numerical superiority. By April 1945, with Germany collapsing, Luftwaffe fighter operations were sporadic at best. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and the complete Allied air superiority meant that German fighters rarely left the ground. When they did, they faced overwhelming numbers of Allied fighters, including Tempests that had become the most feared opponents in the Luftwaffe's experience. The final statistics of Tempest operations tell the story of complete dominance. The Tempest squadrons of 2nd Tactical Air Force claimed 740 German aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat against losses of 128 Tempests to all causes, including anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failure, and combat. The kill ratio of nearly 6-1 was exceptional by any standard. Against fighters specifically, the ratio was even higher. 638 German fighters destroyed against 47 Tempests lost to air combat, a ratio of 13.5-1. No Allied fighter achieved better numbers. More significantly, Tempest squadrons destroyed 246 V-1 flying bombs, protecting British cities from weapons that conventional fighters struggled to intercept. Ground attack missions accounted for thousands of German vehicles, hundreds of locomotives, and countless other targets destroyed. The impact on German morale was severe. Luftwaffe pilots who encountered Tempests and survived spoke of them with fear bordering on terror. Post-war interviews reveal the psychological impact. Oberfeldwebel Heinz Knoker, a veteran with over 200 combat missions, described the Tempest as the most dangerous Allied fighter. You couldn't run from them. You couldn't hide from them. You couldn't fight them. When you saw Tempests, your only option was to pray they didn't see you. Their speed was impossible. Their guns were death itself. I saw them destroy aircraft with single bursts. One moment, a fighter. Next moment, nothing but falling debris. Lieutenant Walter Wolfram, an ace with 137 victories, mostly on the Eastern Front, flew against Tempest in the final months of the war. They were faster than us, climbed better than us, turned with us, and their guns were catastrophically powerful. On the Eastern Front, we could use our experience and tactical skill to overcome Soviet numerical superiority. Against the Tempests, experience meant nothing. They were simply better aircraft, flown by competent pilots with unlimited fuel and ammunition. We called them the Green Devils because of their green camouflage paint and because encountering them meant death. Even Adolf Galland, former General der Jagdflieger and one of Germany's most experienced pilots, acknowledged the Tempest's superiority. In a 1947 interview he stated, "The Tempest was the best piston engine fighter the Allies produced. It was faster than our Focke-Wulf 190D, climbed better than our Messerschmitt 109K, and had firepower that exceeded anything we could match. If the British had produced it a year earlier, our fighter force would have been destroyed even faster." The production numbers tell their own story. By war's end, 1,702 Tempest Mark Vs had been built. This was a fraction of Spitfire production, about 10%, but each Tempest had impact far beyond its numbers. 3 Squadron alone, the 1st Tempest unit, claimed 223 German aircraft destroyed. 486 Squadron, a New Zealand unit flying Tempests, claimed 181. These 2 squadrons, with a combined strength never exceeding 50 aircraft, destroyed more than 400 German aircraft. The Tempest represented British engineering at its finest, taking the lessons learned from years of air combat and creating a fighter that excelled in every regime. It was fast at low altitude where ground attack missions occurred. It was fast at medium altitude where most combat took place. It was fast at high altitude where jets operated. It could turn with German fighters when necessary, but more often it didn't need to turn. It could simply accelerate away or use its superior speed to dictate engagement terms. The cockpit was comfortable and ergonomic. The visibility was exceptional. The controls were heavy but responsive. The aircraft was stable but maneuverable. It was everything a fighter should be, and nothing it shouldn't be. The 4 20mm Hispano cannons were perfectly integrated. The gun sight, Mk2 gyroscopic model, allowed accurate deflection shooting that German reflector sights couldn't match. The ammunition capacity of 800 rounds meant pilots could engage multiple targets without worrying about running dry. The reliability was exceptional. Unlike the Typhoon, which suffered chronic mechanical failures, the Tempest was remarkably dependable. Engine failures were rare. Structural problems were virtually non-existent. The aircraft brought pilots home even when damaged. Flight Lieutenant David Ness of 486 Squadron returned from a mission on January 18, 1945, with his Tempest so badly damaged that ground crews initially thought it should be written off. A 20mm shell had exploded in the starboard wing, tearing a hole 3 feet across. Another shell had penetrated the fuselage just behind the cockpit. The tail had over 40 machine gun strikes. The propeller had been hit by fragments, leaving 2 blades notched and unbalanced. Yet the aircraft had flown 140 miles back to base, landed safely, and was repaired and flying again within a week. This durability wasn't accidental. Sidney Cam had designed redundancy into every critical system. Control cables were duplicated, structural members were overbuilt, the engine mounting could absorb battle damage that would have caused catastrophic failures in other fighters. The fuel system had self-sealing tanks and multiple feed points. Electrical systems had backup generators. Even the hydraulics had manual override options. This philosophy of robust design meant that Tempest survived damage that would have destroyed less carefully engineered aircraft. German pilots who scored hits on Tempests were often shocked to see their target continue flying. Unteroffizier Franz Stigler, who later became famous for escorting a crippled B-17 to safety, encountered a Tempest over the Rhine in December 1944. In a post-war interview, he recalled the engagement. "I got a perfect deflection shot, maybe 200 meters. I saw my shells explode on his wing and fuselage. Good hits. He should have gone down. Instead, he rolled inverted, dove away, and accelerated to a speed I couldn't match. I had damaged him, I'm certain, but he flew away like nothing had happened. Our aircraft would have come apart from that kind of damage. The British built their fighters like they built their battleships, to absorb punishment and keep fighting. The Tempest's operational tempo was remarkable. Unlike German fighters that required extensive maintenance after every mission, Tempest could fly multiple sorties per day. The ground crews, many of them conscripts with minimal training, could rearm and refuel a Tempest in less than 30 minutes. Simple maintenance could be performed at forward airfields with limited facilities. The engines, while powerful and complex, were surprisingly maintainable. The Napier Sabre, so troublesome in the Typhoon, had been refined and debugged by the time it entered Tempest production. The Sabre 2A and later the Sabre 5 were reliable power plants that could run for hundreds of hours between major overhauls. Flight Lieutenant Raymond Baird, the second highest scoring Tempest ace with 57 V1s and 12 aircraft destroyed, described the aircraft's reliability in his memoir. In 6 months of combat operations, I flew the same Tempest, serial number JN7521, on over 200 missions. The aircraft never failed me. The engine never quit. The guns never jammed. The only mechanical issue I experienced was a hydraulic leak that was repaired in less than an hour. Compare this to my experience in Spitfires, where mechanical issues were common, or God forbid Typhoons, where every flight was a gamble with death. The Tempest was a pilot's aircraft, trustworthy, capable, and deadly. This reliability extended to the weapon system. The Hispano cannons, notorious for jamming in early installations, were perfected in the Tempest. The mounting was rigid, preventing the alignment issues that cause malfunctions. The ammunition feed was smooth and consistent. The belt links were improved to reduce jamming. Pilots reported that the guns simply worked every time without fail. The psychological impact of this reliability on pilot confidence cannot be overstated. When you climbed into a Tempest, you knew the aircraft would perform exactly as expected. You knew the guns would fire when you pressed the trigger. You knew the engine would provide full power when needed. This confidence translated into aggressiveness in combat. Tempest pilots didn't hesitate to engage superior numbers because they trusted their aircraft completely. German pilots, by contrast, flew aircraft that were increasingly unreliable as the war progressed. Fuel quality declined, causing engine failures. Manufacturing quality suffered as skilled workers were conscripted. Spare parts became scarce. Ammunition quality degraded. Guns jammed. Engines quit. Structures failed. The psychological burden of flying unreliable equipment into combat against an enemy with perfect equipment was crushing. The Tempest also benefited from another crucial advantage: fuel. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was desperately short of aviation fuel. German fighters often flew training missions with just enough fuel to take off, complete the exercise and land with no reserves for emergencies. Combat missions were planned with minimal fuel margins. Pilots were instructed to avoid extended combat because the fuel simply wasn't available. The RAF had unlimited fuel. Tempest flew with full tanks on every mission. Pilots could afford to patrol for hours waiting for targets. They could engage in extended combat without worrying about fuel state. They could use full throttle settings whenever needed without rationing engine power. This fuel abundance translated directly into combat effectiveness. A Tempest pilot could loiter at high altitude, maintaining position for hours if necessary. When combat began, he could use maximum power throughout the engagement. If the battle went badly, he had fuel to escape. If opportunities arose, he had fuel to pursue. German pilots had none of these luxuries. They flew on minimum fuel, rationed their engine power, and broke off combat early to ensure they had enough fuel to return home. In sustained engagements, Tempest could simply outlast German fighters, waiting for them to run low on fuel and become desperate. Wing Commander Roland Biermont exploited this advantage repeatedly. His tactical doctrine emphasized patience. Tempest formations would climb to altitude, position themselves advantageously, and wait. When German fighters appeared, Biermont's pilots would observe their behavior, identify the experienced pilots from the novices, and plan their attack. Only when conditions were perfect would they strike, diving from altitude with overwhelming speed and firepower. The engagement would last seconds or minutes at most. Then the Tempest would climb back to altitude and resume waiting. This tactical patience drove German pilots to distraction. They couldn't ignore the Tempests overhead, but they couldn't effectively engage them either. If they climbed to attack, the Tempests would use their superior speed to maintain distance or counterattack from advantage. If they ignored the Tempests and focused on their primary mission of attacking bombers, they would be bounced from above with catastrophic results. The only safe option was to avoid the area entirely, which meant abandoning their mission. By early 1945, Luftwaffe tactical doctrine explicitly warned pilots to avoid areas where Tempests were operating. Fighter controllers would vector German formations away from known Tempest patrol zones. Bomber interception missions were cancelled if Tempests were reported in the target area. The psychological dominance was complete. But the Tempest's reputation wasn't built solely on combat performance. It was also built on the pilots who flew it, men like Pierre Clostermann, the French ace who became the highest-scoring Tempest pilot with 33 victories. Clostermann was unusual among fighter pilots. He was educated, articulate, and introspective. His memoir, The Big Show, provides insights into Tempest operations that cold combat reports cannot capture. Clostermann described the sensation of flying the Tempest in passages that capture both the technical and emotional experience. The Tempest is not a gentle aircraft. It doesn't forgive mistakes, but when you fly it correctly, when you use its strengths properly, it transforms you into a predator. You sit high in the cockpit surrounded by armour and bulletproof glass. The visibility is magnificent. You can see everything above, below, to the sides, even behind through the clear view panels. The engine rumbles ahead of you, 2,500 horsepower of brutal power. The guns are loaded, 800 rounds of 20mm destruction. You patrol at 12,000 feet, eyes scanning the sky, searching for targets. Then you see them, dots against the clouds, German fighters climbing toward the bombers. You call the sighting, position your section, and roll inverted into the dive. The acceleration is violent. The Tempest gathers speed like a falling stone. 300 miles per hour, 400, 450, 500. The airframe moans but holds solid. The controls stiffen but remain responsive. The target grows in your gun sight. Range decreases. 1,000 yards. 800, 600, 400. Your thumb moves to the firing button. At 300 yards you press. The aircraft shudders as 4 cannons fire simultaneously. The noise is incredible even through the helmet. You see the shells arc toward the target, see them strike, see the explosions bloom on wings and fuselage. 2 seconds of fire, the target disintegrates, wings fold, fuselage breaks, fire erupts. A fighter becomes wreckage in the space of a heartbeat. You pull hard on the stick, 6G pressing you into the seat. The Tempest groans but responds. You zoom upward, converting speed back to altitude, ready for another attack. Below, your target is falling, burning, finished. This is what the Tempest was built for. This is what it does with mechanical precision. You're not fighting the enemy, you're executing him. The emotional detachment in Clostermann's description reflects a broader truth about late-war air combat. By 1945, aerial warfare had become industrialized slaughter. The romance of dogfighting, the notion of chivalrous combat between knights of the air, had died somewhere over France in 1940. What remained was systematic destruction, skilled pilots using superior equipment to kill less skilled pilots in inferior equipment. The Tempest embodied this brutal efficiency. It wasn't designed to win dogfights through superior maneuverability. It was designed to kill enemy aircraft through overwhelming advantages in speed, firepower, and durability. Tempest pilots didn't seek fair fights. They sought massacre. Wing Commander Beaumont was explicit about this tactical philosophy in his training lectures to new pilots. Forget everything you've heard about chivalry and air combat. Forget fair fights. Our job is to destroy German aircraft with maximum efficiency and minimum risk. We achieve this through systematic exploitation of our advantages. We use speed to control engagement geometry. We use firepower to ensure kills with minimum exposure. We use altitude to maintain energy advantage. We never fight on the enemy's terms. We dictate terms through superior performance. When you have position, attack without hesitation. When you lack position, decline combat and reposition. Never pursue an enemy low and slow. Never engage at disadvantage. Never waste ammunition on low probability shots. Kill efficiently, survive consistently, repeat daily. This cold-blooded approach to combat was typical of late-war RAF fighter doctrine. The lessons of 6 years of warfare had eliminated sentimentality. Pilots who survived were those who fought smart, not brave. The Tempest's performance enabled smart fighting. Its speed allowed pilots to engage or disengage at will. Its firepower ensured that successful attacks were lethal. Its durability meant that even when pilots made mistakes, they often survived. The aircraft was forgiving of pilot error in ways that German fighters were not. A Messerschmitt 109, with its narrow landing gear and tailwheel configuration, was difficult to land. Accidents were common. The Tempest, with its wide-track landing gear and excellent visibility, was relatively easy to land even for inexperienced pilots. A Fokker Wolf 190, with its automatic engine management systems, was easier to fly than a 109 but suffered from high wing loading that made it unforgiving in turning combat. The Tempest had moderate wing loading that provided a good balance of speed and maneuverability. German fighters had limited fuel capacity that forced pilots to make quick decisions in combat. The Tempest's larger fuel capacity gave pilots time to assess situations and make better choices. These accumulated advantages meant that Tempest pilots survived longer, learned faster, and became more effective. The average Tempest pilot who completed his first 10 missions had better than 70% chance of surviving his tour. The average German fighter pilot in 1945 had less than 50% chance of surviving his first 10 missions. The attrition mathematics were unsustainable for Germany and entirely favourable for Britain. But numbers alone don't capture the Tempest's impact. Its psychological effect on the Luftwaffe was equally important. By early 1945, German pilots were exhausted, demoralised, and increasingly aware that the war was lost. Flying against an enemy with better aircraft, better training, unlimited fuel, and overwhelming numbers was spiritually crushing. The Tempest represented everything that was going wrong for Germany. It was fast because British engines were more advanced, and British fuel was higher quality. It was reliable because British manufacturing quality remained high. It was available in large numbers because British industry was undamaged and fully productive. Its pilots were well trained because Britain could afford to train pilots properly. Its guns worked because British ammunition quality was consistent. Every aspect of the Tempest's superiority reflected British industrial and organisational advantages that Germany could not match. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a high-scoring ace and post-war Luftwaffe leader, reflected on this in his memoir, The Straits of Messina. We knew by 1945 that we had lost not just the air war, but the technological war. The Tempest was proof of this. It wasn't just a good fighter, it was a great fighter. Produced in quantity, flown by competent pilots, supported by unlimited resources. We had prototypes that were faster, we had designs that were more advanced, but we couldn't produce them in meaningful numbers. We couldn't train pilots to fly them effectively. We couldn't fuel them for combat operations. The Tempest didn't beat us through technical genius. It beat us through industrial competence applied consistently over years. That was our tragedy. We focused on wonder weapons and super aircraft, while the Allies focused on building large numbers of very good aircraft and training large numbers of competent pilots. Quality mattered, but quantity of quality mattered more. The Tempest Mark V was not even the final evolution. The Tempest Mark II, powered by the Bristol Centaurus radial engine producing 2,590 horsepower, entered service in November 1944. This variant was even faster, reaching 442 miles per hour at 16,000 feet. The Tempest Mark VI, with a strengthened airframe and improved Sabre engine, was in production when the war ended. These improved variants promised even greater performance, but the Mark V had already achieved complete superiority over the Luftwaffe's piston-engine fighters. The arrival of jet fighters like the Me-262 should have changed this calculus. The jets were significantly faster than any piston fighter. But as Tempest pilots demonstrated repeatedly, speed alone doesn't guarantee victory. The Me-262 was fast but had poor acceleration, mediocre maneuverability, and unreliable engines. Tempest pilots exploited these weaknesses ruthlessly. They couldn't catch jets in level flight, but they didn't need to. They caught them during takeoff and landing. They caught them when the jets slowed to attack bombers. They caught them when jet pilots made mistakes. Between October 1944 and May 1945, Tempest pilots claimed 20 Me-262s destroyed. This was fewer than the 28 claimed by Mustang pilots, or the 24 claimed by Thunderbolt pilots, but given the Tempest's shorter range and more limited deployment, the number was proportionally impressive. More importantly, Tempest tactics against jets became the foundation for jet combat doctrine in the post-war era. The principles of energy management, position advantage, and exploitation of enemy weaknesses during critical flight phases would dominate jet combat through Korea and Vietnam. The Tempest pilots who learned these lessons against Me-262s were teaching them to new generations of fighter pilots well into the 1960s. When the war ended in May 1945, Tempest squadrons were scattered across Germany, operating from captured Luftwaffe airfields. They had flown their last combat missions days before the surrender. The transition from war to peace was jarring. Pilots who had been killing Germans daily were suddenly flying over defeated Germany on occupation duty. The psychological adjustment was difficult for many. Flight Lieutenant David Fairbanks, writing in his diary on May 10, 1945, captured the strange emotional state. The war is over. We've won. Germany is defeated. I should feel jubilant. Instead, I feel empty. For 18 months, every day had purpose. We flew, we fought, we killed. The Tempest was our weapon, our protection, our home in the sky. Now it's over. The Tempest sits on the flight line, guns empty, mission complete. I flew over Germany yesterday on a patrol that was no longer necessary. The sky was empty of enemies. The war is won. But I don't know what comes next. The Tempest squadrons were quickly reduced as demobilization began. Pilots returned to civilian life. Aircraft were placed in storage or scrapped. The RAF retained several Tempest squadrons for occupation duty in Germany, but most were disbanded by 1946. The Tempest remained in RAF service until 1951, eventually replaced by jets. Many Tempests were sold to foreign air forces. India, Pakistan, and New Zealand operated Tempest into the early 1950s. The Indian Air Force used Tempest in combat against Pakistan during the First Kashmir War in 1947, the last time the type saw combat. The legacy of the Tempest extended beyond its combat record. The tactical doctrine developed by Tempest squadrons influenced fighter development for decades. The emphasis on speed, firepower, and robust construction became standard for post-war fighters. The lessons learned about energy management and position advantage became fundamental principles of jet combat. The pilots who flew Tempests went on to distinguished careers. Wing Commander Roland Beaumont became a test pilot, flying the English Electric Lightning and other advanced aircraft. Pierre Clostermann became a politician and remained a vocal advocate for strong air power until his death in 2006. David Fairbanks returned to Canada and wrote extensively about his combat experiences. These men and hundreds like them carried the lessons learned in Tempests into the jet age, ensuring that the tactical and operational knowledge gained at such cost was not lost. The technical legacy was equally important. Sidney Cam, the Tempest designer, went on to design the Hawker Hunter, one of the most successful jet fighters of the 1950s. The Hunter incorporated many design principles from the Tempest, including robust construction, heavy armament, and excellent pilot visibility. The Hunter, like the Tempest before it, earned a reputation for reliability and effectiveness that made it one of the most widely exported fighters of its generation. The Napier Sabre engine, refined and perfected in the Tempest, influenced post-war engine development. While piston engines were quickly superseded by jets, the engineering lessons learned from the Sabre program informed British jet engine development for years. Today, only a handful of airworthy Tempests remain. These rare aircraft appear at air shows where they demonstrate the performance that made them legendary. The sound of a Sabre engine at full power, a bellowing roar unique among piston engines, still draws crowds. Pilots who fly these restored Tempests confirm everything the combat reports claimed about the aircraft's performance and handling. The Tempest's place in history is secure, but perhaps not as prominent as it deserves. It was overshadowed by the Spitfire, Britain's most famous fighter. It lacked the long-range escort capability of the Mustang. It didn't have the rugged ground attack reputation of the Thunderbolt. But for pilots who flew it, and for German pilots who faced it, the Tempest was the most feared Allied fighter of the war's final year. The statistics support this reputation. A 13-to-1 kill ratio against German fighters. 20 jet aircraft destroyed. Hundreds of V-1 flying bombs intercepted. Thousands of ground targets destroyed, all this achieved with fewer than 1/800 aircraft produced and fewer than 150 lost to enemy action. No Allied fighter was more effective per aircraft produced. The human cost, as always in war, was significant. 128 Tempest pilots were killed in combat or operational accidents. These men, mostly in their early 20s, died flying one of the finest aircraft of the war. Their graves are scattered across Europe, marked with headstones that note their squadron and rank but cannot capture their skill or courage. The German pilots they faced paid a higher price. Thousands died in unequal combat against superior opponents flying superior aircraft. Many were boys, sent into combat with minimal training, flying aircraft that were worn out and fuel-starved. They never had a chance against the Tempests and the experienced pilots who flew them. There is no glory in their deaths, only tragedy. The Tempest represented the culmination of 6 years of aerial warfare. It incorporated every lesson learned from the Battle of Britain through the bomber offensives of 1944. It was fast where speed mattered. It was armed with weapons that guaranteed kills. It was built to survive. It was reliable enough for sustained operations. It was everything a fighter should be, and nothing it shouldn't be. In September 1944, when Flight Lieutenant Klosterman led his section of 4 Tempests against 24 Messerschmitt 109s over Holland, the engagement lasted 7 minutes and ended with 11 German fighters destroyed. This was not exceptional for Tempest operations. It was typical. The aircraft's performance advantage was so overwhelming that skilled pilots could achieve ratios that would have been impossible in earlier aircraft. The Messerschmitt pilots that day were not incompetent. They were not cowards. They were not poorly trained by the standards of their service. They were simply outmatched by an aircraft that was faster, better armed, more durable, and flown by pilots with superior training and unlimited resources. The outcome was never in doubt. This was the reality of late-war aerial combat. German technical innovation, tactical experience, and individual courage meant nothing against Allied industrial dominance and systematic application of resources. The Tempest was the physical embodiment of this dominance, a fighter so superior that engaging it was effectively suicide. By May 1945, the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Fuel exhaustion, pilot losses, and overwhelming Allied numerical superiority had destroyed German air power. But even if fuel and pilots had been available, the technological gap had become unbridgeable. The best German piston fighters, the Focke-Wulf 190D and the Messerschmitt 109K, were inferior to the Tempest in every parameter that mattered in combat. German jets were faster but too few, too unreliable, and too vulnerable to matter strategically. The sky belonged to the Allies, and the Tempest was the instrument of that dominance. In the end, the Luftwaffe didn't just meet its match in the Hawker Tempest, it met its doom. The aircraft that German pilots had initially dismissed as just another British fighter became the weapon they feared above all others. The green-painted Tempests with their distinctive bubble canopies and 4-cannon wings were harbingers of death. When Tempests appeared, German pilots ran if they could and died if they couldn't. The laughter that Oberleutnant Ralph Hermes and his comrades directed at the P-47 Thunderbolts in April 1943 had long since died. By 1945 there was no laughter left in the Luftwaffe. There was only fear, exhaustion, and the certain knowledge that defeat was inevitable. The Hawker Tempest, arriving late to the war but arriving with overwhelming capability, had ensured that defeat came swiftly and completely. The day the Luftwaffe met its match was not a single day. It was every day from February 1944 forward, every time Tempest climbed into the European sky, every engagement where German pilots discovered that courage and experience were no defence against superior technology and resources. The Tempest ruled the skies because it was engineered to rule them, built to rule them, and flown by men trained to exploit every advantage it provided. This was not a fair fight. War never is. It was systematic destruction executed with mechanical precision, and the Hawker Tempest was the perfect weapon for that grim task.